Can I ask you a quick question on Hobbes?
Yes, Douglas.
It was dawned on me after last class. I haven't had a chance to do really any background research on it. Perhaps you can enlighten me on it. When he introduced the premise pertaining to government and so forth for society, I'm trying to think of the time frame this is occurring, and then what's happening over in the Far East. You know, you had your Ming dynasties, you had your Japan, you had these caste systems, you had these forms of government and societal norms that you do not break. Where does that come into the argument of which came first, or how that fits into the category?
The person I would recommend on that, I mean, there's several, but two come to my mind immediately. One is Francis Fukuyama.
Okay.
If you're familiar with him.
Yeah. Would they have preceded him though, Hobbes?
Oh, yeah, Hobbes is modern.
Right.
Descartes is a contemporary of Thomas Hobbes, so if Descartes the official modern philosopher, which is really not quite so modern, that's 16, thereabouts, right? When you're talking about ancient China, you're going way back to Confucius, at least, and that's the axial age, which would be the same time as Socrates and Buddha, right? So, in fact, those are the three I associate with the axial age. Would be Socrates in Greece, then Buddha in India, and Confucius in China, and they're really a completely separate cultural set of norms and everything. Certainly the Chinese did investigate, explore with really huge ships. It's kind of amazing. They sailed down the coast of Africa. They almost certainly sailed to the west coast of the Americas, and then basically decided, not interested, and they gave up. So the relationship between the Chinese and what we think of as in the West is not anything really that's there is actually one interesting book called The Zuni Enigma by Professor Davis, who was an anthropologist at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, before the comma, or no, while there still was a comma. So it wasn't the unified UAA that we have today. And she argued, and rightly, in retrospect, that there were about 100 or 200 Japanese Buddhists that sailed across the Pacific, landed on the West Coast, and went east, ended up somewhere in the desert, and basically joined a village of natives there. And today you can find in that area that there are a lot of people with Japanese genetic DNA, and there are cultural elements that are Japanese. So it was kind of an enigma. How did all this Japanese culture and DNA get into the West?
Well, I guess my question, maybe I didn't pose it properly. I was just speaking in terms of
who was first?
Right. I mean, if he's modern 1600s, and they already have these systems in place, why are they not attributed to being the first, or is it just someone who's written about it?
Well,
that's more of what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Not so much the association of the two interacting, it's just the
who was first?
Title. Oh, he was the first to X, Y, Z. But these all occurred. Is it just
right. Well, even today we don't refer to the cultural norms, the legitimating narratives of the Chinese as social contract.
Okay.
And I don't, and I think that would be right not to, because they're, at least from what I've never been to China myself, but from what I've read, thanks to Francis Fukuyama and Henry Kissinger, if nobody's mad at me for mentioning him. He's got a terrific book on China, and by the way, he was, of course, famous for opening China with the Nixon administration. Although he points out he was not a Chinese expert, still isn't, but he obviously is in a certain manner of speaking. But the Chinese people do not refer, as I understand it, to things as rights. They do not have what we think of as human rights,
Okay.
or even rights of citizens.
Okay.
And that the government isn't there for the collective interest. So it's still a totalitarian, top-down ruling class that obviously kills people, tortures people, doesn't respect property rights, all that sort of thing. Granted, it's been a tremendous civilization for 5,000 years. So in a manner of speaking, it seems to have been a much more stable and larger society. I mean, there's more people there than anywhere else in the world. If we ever decide, okay, let's let the majority rule in the whole world, the Chinese will win, because there's more Chinese than anyone else. Right? But so when we talk about the legitimating narrative of the social contract, Hobbes is number one, because that's the beginning of it. And that is our actual explanation for why a government is legitimate, is that we basically agree with it. Not that, well, I don't have a choice. And in fact, the reason the government's there is for my benefit as well as everyone else's. In other words, how do we collectively flourish as a group of people? And if we don't like what the governor is doing, then we can, collectively change the government, or at least vote him out when the time comes. I don't know if you saw at the AFN convention yesterday how everybody stood and turned around, gave the fist, backwards to Governor Dunleavy at the AFN convention in Fairbanks. I thought, gosh, they learned that from Middlebury. That's where that, I think, started, standing up backwards and doing the fist. Isn't that where that started?
I don't know.
Middlebury College, when Charles Murray was there. I don't know. But so, Francis Fukuyama, specifically the first volume of his two volume set on the origins of political order, talks about ancient China.
Thank you.
Fascinating stuff. Good question. So really what we're looking at here is something significant that changed the way government worked, which really, of course, led to our Constitution. And John Locke is the second of that, really kind of a triumvirate, the third being Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's the French third leg of the stool, so to speak. And Rousseau, by the way, had a, if you look at the difference between them, Thomas Hobbes thought that the main goal of our social contract was security. To keep ourselves from being killed, have our property stolen, all those kinds of things. We want to protect ourselves And so for Thomas Hobbes, the safest kind of government that we could form would be a absolute monarchy, because that way there's no one going to war with the monarch because he's absolute. He has all the power, etc. And as far as Hobbes was concerned, the monarch's interest would be one with the interest of the nation, because there's nothing to separate them. It's not like the king would be more concerned about his own children than the best interest of the entire nation. In Hobbes's mind, that was the values were pick a good verb for that. They would be the same, right?
Indiscernible.
Good. That's a good one. Yeah. In fact, Charles I, when he was on trial, used that as his argument. They were charging Charles I as a traitor. His defense: how could I be a traitor? I'm the king. My will is the will of the nation. So anything I was, right? So I couldn't be a traitor. I'm by definition, who you should be loyal to, right? Etc. John Locke is different than Hobbes, because John Locke feels that the main reason for our contract is not just security, although if in the article that we look at, it is primarily our security, but it wasn't only that. And the problem is that the king could take some of your rights. For Locke, you don't give them up completely. And so if the king isn't doing his job, or her job, we actually have the right to overthrow the king. But if you look at the difference, Hobbes, of course, is supporting not only Charles I, but also Charles II, right? And so he's in support of the monarch, against revolution. But Locke is on the side of William of Orange, who's coming in as a revolution. Actually, Mary, his wife, is a legitimate daughter of James II, who they were throwing out, right? So in a sense, you could see the succession there to Mary as the legitimate. So in that sense, William, being the wife of Mary, is kind of a ruler along with her, right? But at the same time, when William came over, part of the deal with Parliament was that William would not be an absolute monarch. He would be a limited monarch, which of course is what England continues to be after that point. The Queen, when she gave her speech on the 14th of October in Parliament, which was absolutely gorgeous. I don't know if you got a chance to watch it and see all the jewels. She wore all the jewels. I guess I should. The Queen's speech.
I hate and love telling people that they're not the Congress they voted for. Nobody understands.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority has always been to secure the
Here you go. First quiz question for tonight. How much was her outfit worth?
Oh.
I wonder.
What happens if we get it right?
I'll give you my lunch. I bet they have a quote on the. Notice even the microphone is made out of gold. I don't know why he keeps kind of moving forward like that. It looked kind of creepy.
Trying to understand it, Garth.
My government remains committed to ensuring that resident European citizens who have built their lives
So she keeps referring to my government, and she lists through all the points, which, by the way, I'm sure Boris Johnson actually wrote. Right? You know, that's, he's the prime minister. He- Pardon?
She's leaving office October 31st, the Queen? Is that what it says?
No, Brexit.
No, it's
Brexit.
Right, backwards.
Yeah, Brexit. She's there till death.
Okay, that's what I thought.
In fact, I'm not sure.
She's 90-something, right?
94, I think. So maybe
She's a G, she's
maybe she
great.
did die already, and she's still there. You know.
She's still there in the head, so it looks good.
Yeah. Well, I showed you last week how she parachuted out of the plane, you know, into. So clearly they like all the pageantry and everything. Remember, pomp and circumstance,
Oh, yeah.
right? You know, we even have all that. But when she's referring to my government, everything is actually run by the Parliament, not by the Queen. I don't know what amount of authority the Queen actually has, et cetera. It's kind of interesting for this speech, by the way. One of the MPs, the parliamentarians, was kidnapped and taken to Westminster as a hostage until they released the Queen. So apparently that's a tradition for the Queen's speech, the King's speech, that they've been doing ever since Charles I, because of course they didn't give Charles I back except in 2 pieces, right? Could have been funny, but no one likes my jokes, I guess. Oh well. All right. But so Hobbes is pro absolute monarchy. Locke is on the side of William and Mary, and it's a limited monarchy. And as a result, his version of the social contract is adjusted for the checks and balances, right? Because the executive is not free to do whatever they want, right? Instead, they have to execute the law based on what Parliament. So Parliament is the legislative body that makes the law, and the king is the executor. Of course, today it's, you know, the Queen is really, I think, 90% just for tourism. Not sure what authority she could actually have fired Boris. I saw that being argued at a certain point. You know, the prime minister, they could actually, the Queen could actually change him. So there are, I suppose, some significant aspects to their relationship. With Rousseau, on the other hand, so Hobbes and Locke are both British. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is French. And his version of the social contract is completely different. Now, let me kind of introduce this a little bit by saying that Rousseau was initially an opera composer. You could go look it up. The whole opera's on the web if you're interested. And it was okay. It was sort of a hit. It wasn't a big hit. But he was disappointed that his career didn't absolutely take off as an opera composer. And so he communicated with a friend of his who is nicknamed Voltaire. I suppose you've heard of him. Yes, maybe, maybe not. Oh, I didn't spell it right, but it's cool. So his real name was Francois Marie Arouet. I don't know how you say it. Arouet. All those years of French, and I'm hopeless when it comes to French. Arouet? Arouet? How do you say that?
I would think it's Arouet.
Arouet?
Arouet.
Arouet? Je ne
That's
sais
a hard
pas.
one.
Mon français est terrible.
Moi aussi.
Okay, so of course Voltaire, much easier to say, was a nickname, which meant I forget what it meant. It meant something like he stole the house or something that he lived in. I forget. You could look it up.
Name, will,
Does it say on there?
you will scroll down. Just said name.
The author adopted the name Voltaire following his incarceration at the Bastille. Its origin is unclear. Oh well.
It's an
I thought I
anagram
read
for
somewhere.
Arouet.
Pardon?
It's an anagram for Arouet.
Oh.
The Latinized spelling of his surname, Arouet.
Well, cool. I think I knew that once, but I sort of forgot it, when I learned something else about, like how to tie shoes or something. It just, threw that out. But here's the neat thing. Voltaire and Rousseau are friends. And by the way, a lot of people don't think so. They think that they hated one another, because if you read the letters, they say absolutely nasty things back and forth to one another. But I read them and I thought, you know what? Only real friends wrote to one another like that. So they're saying nasty, you and your cane, and these are two guys that are teasing one another, right? That like one another. But Rousseau asked, how do I become famous? And Voltaire says, write books that say exactly the opposite of what everybody believes. So Voltaire writes a book on education. And he says, the best education is no education. By the way, our education department still teaches that book as if it's a good idea. That's true, they do. The best kind of government? No government. And he became popular. Everybody loved his arguments. Why is, in fact, the true native living, and this became famous, the native in the untouched, uncivilized land, like in what became the United States. The natives in the woods became like the picture of the true human without the corruption of civilization imposed on them. That once we start civilization, that is what corrupts this true virtuous native. And some of the novels that treat natives that way, like I guess one of the most famous is The Last of the Mohicans, right? Treat the native as like just pure virtue, but civilization corrupts. By the way, that's just the opposite of the way the Heart of Darkness is portrayed by, I don't remember the author of The Heart of Darkness. That's pretty embarrassing. But remember, if you're familiar with that, which was also used in the movie Apocalypse Now, that was kind of the same basic plot, was that you go into the heart of the jungle and you're looking for that pure innocence, but instead what you discover is the horror, which is actually something that we bring ourselves into that natural habitat, right? So for, I still can't think of the name of that author, but
Is it Conrad or?
Yeah.
Thank you. Joseph Conrad, yeah. So, yeah. So Rousseau says, that no government is the best government because all governments corrupt. So we were better off without government. So for Rousseau, the state of nature is wonderful. Not a dog-eat-dog world where life is solitary, short, and all those other nasty things that Thomas Hobbes talks about. So for Hobbes, we form a social contract, form a government to protect ourselves from how horrible nature is. Rousseau strategically writes just the opposite of what everybody's all accepting and becomes famous for his ideas, following Voltaire's suggestion in a letter. That's how you become famous, is write just the opposite of what everyone else believes. And so when I read Rousseau, I'm thinking, he's just saying, these arguments aren't good, these don't work. But he became famous because they were just the opposite of what everyone suggested. And by the way, the French Revolution in 1789 was based on Rousseau's ideas and became the terror, right? They discovered that to try to set a government up based on Rousseau's ideas absolutely caused pure chaos and didn't work, right? And in fact, even Robespierre, who was the instigator of much of that and tried to set up the government for that, and created, I think, almost single-handedly the guillotine, which became the symbol of the terror, ended up being killed by the guillotine himself eventually. So that's how that worked. So the French Revolution based on Rousseau was a dismal failure until, of course, a new empire eventually was created by Napoleon, which was not a democracy, right? Totally not, right? A democracy. And when Napoleon ended up, of course, losing at Waterloo and eventually dying in the island of Elba, right? Which, by the way, you could go visit if you want. It's a tourist place where you could go and see where Napoleon lived his last years and so on. It went back to a king, right? France, in that sense, did not survive the revolution.
The story of being the son is a sad one. The story of being the son is a sad one.
Napoleon?
The son, King of Rome.
Yeah, not familiar with that one, but
He was handed off to Vienna as a young child. And Napoleon
that was
pined.
part of a trade, wasn't it?
Yes.
For security, yeah.
And Napoleon pined for him the whole time. And in exile, he wasn't allowed to see his son or speak to him at all. And he ended up dying lonely from that. It's an interesting story.
Yeah, pretty. Of course, the tomb of Napoleon is one of the proudest monuments that Paris has, I think. Again, I've not physically been there, but I've been there with my gods. Okay. So Rousseau is kind of the third social contract philosopher. We still have them. Our contemporary authority is not alive any longer. He died, I think, in 2000 something, was John Rawls. 2002, so he died 2002. But if you go to law school, John Rawls will be one of those philosophers that you'll study in political science. In fact, in graduate school, you get, from what I understand, in University of Chicago, there's 2 courses in graduate school on his work. First one on his first book, Theory of Justice, and the second based on his second book, Political Liberalism. There's Theory of Justice, 1971, and Political Liberalism here. And when you look at what's different in this is, well, Thomas Hobbes says that the state of nature is nasty, brutish, miserable, short, all those horrible things. Dog eat dog, everyone, in a fight against everyone else. John Locke says, no, the state of nature, he's still not assuming that what he's describing might ever have actually existed, but John Locke says all humans grow up in a family, and we all love one another, and as a result, we start forming a government as things get too complex for mom to keep everybody in control. And so what we do is we start forming governments to protect our life, our property, etc., right? But when you get to John Rawls, who's a Harvard professor, the situation is no longer in a way where you can hypothesize a state of nature and figure out what government ought to have been for. Instead, we have to look at the way the situation is now and figure out how do we improve it, right? So for John Rawls, instead of arguing what a state of nature might be, he instead looks at what he now calls the original position, which is the way things are in law, the way we have it now. And he argues that legislators need to put what he calls a veil, what did he call it? A veil of, not invisibility, what did he call it? The veil of, original position, a veil of ignorance. A veil of ignorance. You have to put a veil of ignorance over your head. So basically, you don't know where your butter is breaded. No, wait. Your bread is butter, right? In this current situation. But instead, you have to try to examine the current legal situation as if you could be anybody, including the impoverished, the poor, and then make whatever laws, change the laws in such a way that they would help those with the least. So any changes we make in the law should be made in order to help those who have the least, right? That's, now obviously this is a liberal point of view, if you think about it. By the way, at the time of John Rawls at Harvard, the opponent to John Rawls at Harvard, who was the conservative, was Robert Nozick. Who was also dead. 2002, they died together. I don't know, amazing how that worked. Although Rawls was much older, I think, than Nozick. Nozick was what, only 68, I think? 63.
Maybe I thought it was 81.
Well, I think drugs had something to do with it.
Oh.
When Robert Nozick was a young student, he was one of those, I think he was even in the Students for a Democratic Society at the time. And he was on, I think he tried drugs and stuff, but then he like saw the light, went back to Harvard, became a fantastic student, and then professor, so. Kind of an interesting, and conservative, so that's kind of interesting. Okay. But so back to John Locke. John Locke led an interesting life, mostly academic, but also a medical doctor at the time. Was connected to the royalty on the side of the Protestants, which when Charles II came back, and then James II, when Charles II died, James was a Catholic, and so you ended up with a country that was very unhappy being ruled by a Catholic when they were mostly Protestant. And eventually they, of course, invited William of Orange, who was Protestant, into the country to replace James. And Locke was on that side. And for a time, Locke was in France for about 15 years, I think. He also was with William of Orange and Mary in the Netherlands. William of Orange, who was invited to come and replace James, was a stadtholder in the Netherlands, which was the closest thing they had to a king in that particular country, right? So he was a ruler there, and he kept that position, by the way. And one of the main reasons that William wanted the kingship was because by doing that he was uniting both the British and the I almost said Neanderthal, Netherland forces against France, who was the main enemy for them. That was Louis XIV at the time. The Earl of Shaftesbury was the royal that he was connected to. And by the way, really became an important member of that household because as a surgeon, he saved the Earl's life when he had I think it was a kidney ailment, and he operated and fixed it, saved his life, and as they say, changed history. Okay. So another aspect of Locke that's really important, and I'm pretty sure we don't cover it later on in the course, but I'll bring it up now, and that has to do with the nature of knowledge. When we look at Thomas Hobbes, remember that he thought all knowledge comes into the mind through the motions that penetrate our eyes from the objects we see, and the sounds that we hear, and the things that we touch, and the tastes, etc. Everything is physical motions. And that goes right into the brain and continues on into speech and reactions and so on. Locke accepts a lot of that. There's no real problem with that. But what he recognizes, and he's not the only one, there are others that are contemporaries of John Locke that also talk about this, that realize that what we're seeing are not the things themselves. Same thing with the things we touch and hear and so on. What we're aware of are the motions of the particles that go into our brain, and not the things themselves. So when I see you guys, or the table, or whatever I'm looking at, I'm not actually seeing them. I'm experiencing the particles that enter into my brain. So we end up with a distinction between what he calls the primary qualities of the things. This is what others of his day are also talking about, right? So they're seeing the primary quality. We're not actually seeing the primary qualities of things, which is what really makes them up, right? What we're seeing and experiencing are the secondary qualities, the effect that the primary qualities have on our senses. That's actually two different things. So we're seeing things as humans see them. By the way, if a snake looks at something, notice everybody tells us that snakes see in the infrared or something, so when they look at bodies, they see heat. They don't see them the way we see them, right? We know this. This is common sense for us today. In fact, I would argue that John Locke's point of view as a materialist was the beginnings of what we think of today as common sense. Because we know when we're looking at things, we're seeing things the way they seem to us, right? When I look at that, color, the blanket, right? And I look at the blanket and all the colors on that blanket, I see blue and black and all these other colors. Well, the blanket itself actually has no color, right? It only looks like it has colors to a human with eyes. That also, by the way, has a language that talks about colors, right? Different languages have different colors. So I've been raised to view the colors that I have in my experience because of the English that I speak, right? And so when I'm looking at that blanket under different circumstances, the light changes the way the colors look, right? I'm seeing what I'm normally going to say, that's the blanket. I can describe the blanket and the colors of the blanket. They're not actually the colors of the blanket, they're the colors of my sense perceptions of the blanket, right? So I'm describing the way it looks to me, the way something tastes to me, right? You can just fill that in. And we all say that, right? We all know that. We probably all say that I see the cabinet and it's gray. But if I asked you about it, you oh, well, yeah, I'm not actually seeing the cabinet. I'm experiencing the cabinet through my eyes. We can do that, right? You're familiar with that idea that we've got a particular perspective on things, right? But the way things actually are is something we would never actually be able to know. In fact, in a manner of speaking, there is no such thing, right? There, because outside of our perspective or our perception of things, in a sense, they don't really exist. By the way, did you like that first question on how expensive the Queen's outfit was? That's a good one. Well, how about this is the second question? And this is absolutely required in a philosophy course, your intro to philosophy course. If a tree falls in the forest,
I've heard this before.
and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? You've heard, that's a famous one, right? By the way, we actually associate that with George Berkeley, who is a follower of Locke, by the way. Locke, of course, is going to have followers. George Berkeley is going to be a bishop from Ireland, although his family is from England, and they moved to Ireland, but he always thought of himself as Irish. He's a friend of Jonathan Swift, by the way, author of Gulliver's Travels, George Berkeley. Let me see if I could find this for you. This is fun. this isn't the movie. Shoot. This is a couple students making up their own version of the movie.
I'm afraid it is, Sophie.
Let's learn.
All right then.
I don't know how good this is. Let me go back and look.
He was in a Pearson?
Well, he believed the only things that exist are that which we see.
It's after 4.
And the next grade could talk
Shoot,
next
that's
year.
not the movie either. It's another group of students
We'll have to
making.
save that.
Nope. I'm gonna have to give up. Why is? Oh, here we go. Okay, this is the Swedish movie. There's a book called Sophie's World or Sophie's Welt. That's Sophie. Is that really? Sophie's Miss Adams.
Ja.
Hör mir mal zu, mein Kind. Ist der Tisch wirklich?
Is the table real?
Was wirst du fühlen, wenn du draufschlägst?
Irgendwas Festes, Hartes.
He's in the mirror,
Bist
not in
du
the.
wirklich Miss Amundsen?
Are you real?
Ich denke schon.
I think so.
Wer sind Sie?
Who are
Mein
you?
Name ist Barclay. George Barclay.
Ich bin Sophie.
Das Einzige, was wirklich ist, ist die Macht des Herrn, mein Kind.
The only thing that's real is the power of God.
Herr Sophie. Gott.
Alberto.
Danke sehr, Mr. Knox. Alles, was du fühlst, verdankst du nur der Macht des Herrn. Die Frage ist, was sind wir? Sind wir Menschen aus Fleisch und Blut?
Are we men out of
Oder sind wir nur
flesh and blood?
Bewusstsein? Mr. Knox, ich hoffe, dass Sie nun weitermachen.
It's just a cool movie. It goes through the whole history of philosophy. And I think you could find versions of it with subtitles and or English. Obviously, students are out there making their own versions of it, which is kind of not nearly as good. But George Barclay is going to have a bone to pick with John Locke, because John Locke argues that everything that exists is material. Aristotle, right? There is no spiritual stuff, right? It's only physical material. But by the way, our minds, which are physical, only see the particles that enter into them and not the things themselves, right? We can't actually see it. So therefore, what can we know about the things themselves? Well, John Locke argues that we can figure out what the primary qualities are, primarily because they have to have shape, they have mass, basically. So for example, if I'm playing football and I get tackled with the football and I've got this, pigskin muddy football stuffed in my face in the bottom of the pile, right? I'm smelling something that is not necessarily the characteristics of the football. It's my interpretation of the football. I feel the surface of the pigskin, etc. That's the way it feels to me, etc. But I'm not wrong about the mass that the football actually takes up, right? That I can't make it go away. It's resistant there. By the way, we still like to say that when we're experiencing reality everything is, in a sense, socially constructed except those things that you can't make go away. Right? You know, we can change a lot of our interpretations of things, but when you get right down to it, there's stuff there that the socially constructed reality won't enable us to change, and that's the primary qualities of things, right? But Berkeley criticizes Locke's opinion by pointing out that any of the hypotheses we make about those primary qualities are exactly that. They're hypotheses, right? Not an awareness, a direct awareness of what things really are made of, right? And by the way, that doesn't go away when we use equipment. So if I use an electronic microscope, right, to look at things, did I say that right? Electronic, right? Electron, thank you. Microscope to look at the smallest particles I can. I'm not actually seeing those particles. I'm seeing the results of a device, right? I remember when I was a kid, they had a commercial or a advertisement in a magazine for a new device called a Sony tape recorder. And they had a picture of this Sony tape recorder, which was on a table in the woods with two great big reels. And underneath it, and by the way, in the woods, behind the tape recorder was a tree going like this, right? In a still photo, you could see the blur, right? So obviously a tree was falling in the woods. And underneath the tape recorder, it said, "What Sony hears is." Oh, it's such a good tape recorder, right? Well, they were wrong. Because when you were listening to the playback of the tree falling, you weren't listening to the tree falling, you were listening to the tape playing sounds. If you think about it, hey, watch yourself here. Don't, so the devices we use to extend our abilities don't cross that leap to give us an actual direct understanding of what the thing really is, right? They certainly do give us more information, etc., but we're still trapped, as David Hume would later say, solipsistically, right? We're trapped in our own selves. So in a sense, all I can be aware of are my own impressions, my own ideas, my own perceptions, or what they will call phenomena, right? Remember the concept of the lantern, that as I go around in the dark, the only thing I can see in the dark are the things that I light up for myself with my own lantern, right? So my senses are my lantern that are letting me see the world. But as I see the world, what I'm seeing is the world according to Bill Jamison, right? That's the way it looks to me, right? So I'm trapped. I can't get outside of that to see the actual physical things. And believing in Locke, who argues that so we can't really know the way the world is in itself, except for the primary qualities, is going to leave us stuck, because we're never really going to be able to see the way the world is, says George Berkeley, right? And so we're going to end up becoming skeptics. And George Berkeley, Catholic, or rather Episcopalian bishop, right, argues that the things that we're going to be able to predict as a result of John Locke's materialist philosophy is that eventually people will begin thinking that God created everything and then just left it. It's like the clockmaker, right? He's not the kind of God that we could pray to and who might interact with us, right? And worse, we're also going to be absolute skeptics when it comes to knowing anything, because we won't, by his philosophy, we'll never actually know anything. And so Berkeley argues that Locke's position is self-contradictory, to say that we can know that there are primary qualities of things when there's no way for us to actually know the primary qualities of things is a contradiction, right? And so Berkeley argues that what we do experience, the phenomena, is what there is. But all that is this energy in the world, the spiritual energy that comes from God, right? So God is constantly interacting with the world. It's not that the world can be totally independent of God, because God created it as a material world and it's on its own without any input from God. Instead, if everything is essentially the mind of God, the energy in the mind of God, then God is basically involved in everything that happens, and we would still have reason for praying to God and asking God for help and so on. And what we'd be experiencing really is, because everything exists in the mind of God. By the way, I would say that that's an interpretation of what Gottfried Leibniz was arguing, and Berkeley was a correspondent with Gottfried Leibniz, so you end up with Leibniz's point of view being shared by Berkeley. In fact, Gottfried Leibniz was one of the ones that invented calculus at the same time as Sir Isaac Newton. There's a book called The Calculus Wars, by the way. And that's between Sir Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz. I could also mention an American philosopher, Jonathan Edwards. When Berkeley, I should go back to George Berkeley here. George Berkeley came up with the idea of creating a college in Bermuda. It would be the first college in the New World. He went to the king, King George, and suggested it, and the king liked the idea and decided he would fund it. So Berkeley married, number one, and then got in a ship and headed to the colonies. Before he went to Bermuda to start the college, though, first he went to Rhode Island, where he set up a farm. And while he was there, he met and was a preacher at many of the churches in the area. And Jonathan Edwards was a young man, seminarian at the time. And when we look at their two philosophies, we see similarities in all of this. And a lot of folks will argue that it was Jonathan Edwards that actually influenced Berkeley, but that seems clearly the opposite to me, that Berkeley was the one that influenced Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is perhaps the first American philosopher and theologian, fire and brimstone type revivalist theologian, and by the way was the president of Princeton when he died. Kind of an interesting person. I have an interest in Jonathan Edwards because one of my mentors from my alma mater was a Jonathan Edwards specialist. And in fact, edited one of the volumes of his collected works. And when he died, gave it to me. So that's kind of one of those neat things. However, so back to Locke. So Locke, in looking at knowledge, argues that all of the knowledge in our head basically comes from all of those incoming particles and so on. But he thinks we can use that to know stuff about, the primary qualities. Notice Berkeley's going to critique that. And by the way, David Hume will critique Berkeley. And David Hume is the end of that chain of British empiricists who ends up becoming the one that everybody blames for skepticism. He's the skeptic par excellence. But John Locke. Some other interesting things about John Locke. While he was working for the Earl of Shaftesbury, Shaftesbury was involved in the trade with the colonies. They decided, hey, it's a good idea, let's trade with other folks. We can make money doing that. Turns out, yes, that works out. It helps build what's called an empire. And that included slaves. And John Locke turned out to be the main administrator of the commission that ran all of that. And as part of his job, he also was the one that wrote the Constitution for the Carolinas and contracts and things of that sort. And when it comes to slavery, by the way, I think I already mentioned that his argument is that if you're in a war and you lose and your opponent ends up capturing you, you are now his property. And so basically, if he takes you, and instead of, he could kill you whenever he likes, but if he decides he has a use for you, he brings you, back and keeps you as property or whatever, you are his property, and no one else can take it in the same way that, they're not supposed to steal anything else of yours, right? And by the way, that also means that you can't become part of a social contract, because you're not, in that sense, a free person. You're bound as a slave. You might be temporarily bound, depending on how, right? Some people actually sold themselves into servitude or slavery. It's kind of interesting learning that many of the original slaves going to the new colonies were Caucasian. And children from England even. I remember the
Paying off debt of the voyage.
or if you were in the wrong place. Remember the book Kidnapped? Did you read that when you were a kid? Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped. The boy was actually set up by his uncle, because the uncle didn't want him, and had him captured by pirates. And of course, he ended up being on the Jolly Roger, wasn't it? When they went and looked for the whatever. No, nobody reads that stuff.
Also homeless, and so they empty jails
Homeless,
too, right?
they empty jails. If you were drunk on the street at night and the pressers came along, you woke up out at sea, and now that was your
But
fate.
that was a distinction between the slave and who went into servitude to pay off debt, as opposed to the convicts that you saw go down to the Georgia colonies that were actually prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a distinction with those who were imprisoned or crime,
Yeah.
criminals, as opposed to a family indebted to the government, and the only way they could repay it was they sent their son on the boat over. He became set up with a family or someone and had basically their slave until it was paid off. And they'd say take 3 years, but it would go 7 years.
A lot of them died before they ever paid it off.
Exactly right.
Kind kind of neat. This book points out that white slaves tended not to work very well. In the hot area, Carolinas was considered tropical at the time, and working out on the plantation was too much for them, so their life expectancy was, the Irish were about 4 years. So one of the things that they discovered were the black slaves were much more valuable because they could work in the fields much, they all day and still be fine. But black slaves were much more expensive, but it was worth it because they lasted a lot longer. That's this book. Pretty interesting. Okay. So just that little bit on slavery. It's confusing what John Locke ended up thinking about slavery as he got older. Apparently a lot of his experience running all of this convinced him that it wasn't really a very good system, but I'm not sure that he changed anything. He still, of course, argued that when you form the social contract, the individuals that form the contract are the ones that are named in the contract. So women, for example, didn't include women in the contract. It was the land-owning elite that were the members of the contract, right? And not their children, not their property, right? There were, of course, you're familiar probably with the arguments over when the Constitution was written. There was a compromise that enabled slaves to be counted as, I think it was 3/5 of a person. Anybody remember?
2/3.
2/5? 2/3?
2/3.
3/5?
I thought it was 2/3.
Memory.
Part of the whole.
Part of a whole.
Oh, well. Okay.
And that was because they were concerned that if they allowed the number of slaves full vote, that the ratio would throw off the power distribution.
We give the southern states too much power.
Yeah, you'd have a small number.
But if you didn't count them at all, it wouldn't give the southern states as much power.
The 3/5 compromise was a compromise reached among state delegations during the 1787 United States Constitutional Convention, whether and or if so, how slaves would be counted when determining the state's total population for legislative representation and taxing purposes. So it's 3/5.
And black males did get the vote first. Women got it later. It's also kind of interesting that women were considered have voting rights in Alaska first. You familiar with that? Yeah, that was kind of interesting. Lots of things happened first here. It's, I think, also one of the reasons why natives' rights are very different in Alaska, except for Metlakatla, which is the only place where there's a reservation of the style from the lower 48 states.
Didn't they also pass abortion law here first before Roe v. Wade?
I'm not familiar with that, but I can check with some of my friends who were probably involved in doing it. They're still alive. Vic Fisher is still alive. He was part of the Constitutional Convention of Alaska, and he's still. By the way, his wife, Jane Anvik, is speaking on Sunday at 9 o'clock at the Anchorage Unitarian Universalist Fellowship on the fair that attempt to get more taxes from the oil companies. I forget what that's, fair something, fair profits or fair. Okay, so Locke. Lots of things could be mentioned about him. The video that I posted that I thought was a good. It's between Christina Hoff Sommers and Sir Roger Scruton. You'll notice he's one of my favorites. She is too.
instead of being out on the street mingling.
I don't know if you had a chance to listen to that, but they're pretty interesting as well. And that ties in free speech, etc. Okay. I also have a link to some resources on Thomas Jefferson. I don't know how user-friendly this is. You could actually explore this and find, bless you, all sorts of interesting resources here. But of course, you could always just look up Thomas Jefferson. I was just impressed because I got to visit the University of Virginia, but Thomas Jefferson. And of course you could visit his house, the little, pardon? Monticello. I thought it said small mountain, but Monticello, I'm not sure what Monticello stands for. Pretty interesting stuff.
Was he a philosopher? That's maybe a silly question.
I would argue that you're a philosopher.
Okay.
So I'm sure he was a philosopher too.
Okay.
I'm very confused about who's a philosopher, as you can tell, because by definition, Aristotle says all men love to know, and what is a philosopher? Someone who loves to know.
Okay.
Well, if Aristotle's right, everybody is a philosopher, right? So that's one problem I have with that. But clearly, if we're thinking in terms of people that have had a tremendous impact, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Judith?
Were they educated in England?
Thomas Jefferson was educated at William and Mary College in Williamsburg, in Virginia, which was the capital of Virginia at the time, not Richmond. And you could visit Williamsburg, by the way, and that's a fun thing. It's a little village that's kept basically, theoretically, the way it was, so that you could see what the village would be like. It's like a theme park, really. There's a big entrance place where you can go and
Welcome to Colonial Williamsburg, home to the largest living history museum and 2 world-class art museums. There's no other place like it. I'm here to help you make the most of your visit with us. Whether you're a new visitor or a longtime friend, I can help you find what you're looking for, and maybe even show you a few things you never knew were here. Colonial Williamsburg is a magical trip through time that connects you firsthand to the courageous struggle of a new nation, plus the everyday lives of the leaders, laborers, artists, and tradespeople who built America. So now join me in Colonial Williamsburg for an inspiring, romantic, and unforgettable journey onward into the past. The first thing you
they
need
have
to know
restaurants
is
that are
this.
period
Your ticket
restaurants.
is your key to fun and exploration at Colonial Williamsburg. You'll be a
It's
first-class
expensive,
passenger on a trip back in time the American
It's like,
Revolution,
I
and
think
the years leading up to
$25
it.
a piece to
When
get in,
Williamsburg was Virginia's capital
or something
and
like
played a
that. I
pivotal
don't know what
role
it is now.
in America's
That
fight
was years
for
ago.
independence. So the next thing to do is go to any of our ticket locations and get your tickets. Our customer service professionals are here to help you make them.
Big tourist thing. Also very close to Busch Gardens, which is another, yeah, I think Busch Gardens, isn't that the only theme park where you can go and get drunk while you're enjoying all the rides?
I don't know, I always
Those
went
two
as a
are
kid.
Those two are separate?
Yeah.
Yeah, the beer distillery is a little separate than the theme park, it's like right near.
We went to Busch Gardens on our 4th wedding anniversary in Tampa, Florida. And Donna ended up getting sick because she drank too much beer while we were walking around in the hot sun. So there was free beer everywhere we went. So,
Yeah.
but that was in '76.
Like that in Ireland too. Go to Cork, Ireland, get a tap right outside the building, and just go and fill your mug up.
I remember at an Oktoberfest in Germany where Donna's cousin took us, and I went over and ordered one beer, and they made a mistake and gave me an entire pitcher. I realized that they didn't make a mistake. That was one beer. I was like, that would kill me if I drank that. So I drank like that much, and I stood around wondering, what the hell do I do with the oh, I'm sorry. What do I do with the rest of it? You know?
On your definition.
And Norbert, who had already drunk his, drunk that one too, and then drove us home.
You didn't hear the expression at Oktoberfest, ex-machen?
Ex Machina? No machine?
Well, it's their expression for bottoms up.
Ah,
So if you say,
Ex
"Don't drink the
Machina
whole
is
thing,
Latin
stop."
for from the machine, but I'm confused. Okay.
They have an advent calendar at Costco that's all German beer right now for Christmas. I bought one yesterday.
I'm not suggesting everybody go out and drink beer. That's
Or
not,
try.
or, of course, the funnest thing would be to drink the beer and then go out driving on an icy road. That would be.
Oh, perfect.
No, not a good idea. We've already had deaths because of icy roads.
Have we?
We have. A young lady in Kenai rolled her car off the road. Had another guy who was drunk on the Glen, went on the wrong side of the Glen and crashed into somebody else just here in Eagle River.
You had the accident this last winter where they ended up in the median. They'd gotten out of their cars and somebody else went into the median and.
Killed them.
Mhm.
Not a good thing. So we can't even joke about that. It's too serious. Okay. But why bring up Jefferson? Jefferson, on his wall in Monticello, however you say it, had 3 paintings on the wall, which I got to see. They're still there. His 3 heroes. And the first one is Francis Bacon, who we mentioned. The second one is John Locke. And the third one is Sir Isaac Newton. So those were his 3 heroes. So clearly when we look at the influence on him, and I'm sure a lot of the founding fathers and the Constitution, it was John Locke's political philosophy that was the one that had the most influence. And where that really shows up is in the checks and balances. And in fact, they added one more to John Locke, because John Locke thought there should be checks and balances between the executive and the legislative. But remember, in Britain, the executive also includes the judiciary. But in the US Constitution, what we have are checks and balances between three different powers: the executive, the legislative, which creates the law, and the judiciary, which is a check on both of them, actually. So, questions on Jefferson or John Locke or Voltaire, any of these folks? Should we take a break and then come back and do John Stuart Mill? Sounds like fun? Or not? Be careful out there. Isn't this Halloween?
Yeah.
Before Halloween or something? I don't know what's going on out there, but if you see goblins and other things, don't be surprised.
We decorated the men's restroom ceiling.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, it's interesting.
And I don't know if even the doors are unlocked. I think they locked some of the doors into this area to keep the little kids from getting in here. And we don't want them hearing these kinds of classes because it could do damage.
They might become philosophers.
If they didn't vandalize it like the poor kids did on this Vegas. Went into one of the mobiles and burned a desk, busted lights, set out fire extinguisher, up kind of crazy. The kids, poor kids, from different schools. They're from
There's a few in every school.
So no subtitles for this.
So I haven't interpreted that stuff. Oh, is it
The original movie was in Swedish.
It's gotta be in English.
Come on, you're not going to find your subtitles for a foreign film?
It's silent. I only speak two languages, sorry.
Ja,
Hör mir mal zu, mein Kind. Ist der Tisch wirklich?
Is the table real?
Was wirst du fühlen,
What you feel
wenn du draufschlägst?
when you hit it?
irgendwas Festes, Hartes.
Something strong, hard.
What language is this?
Deutsch,
Bist du wirklich
German.
Miss Amundsen?
German?
Ich denke schon. Aber
This state is
wer
shown.
sind Sie?
I think
Mein Name ist Barclay.
My name's Mark.
George Barclay.
Ich bin Sophie.
Das Einzige, was wirklich ist die Macht des Herrn, mein Kind.
the only thing that's real is the power of God.
Der Herr, Sophie. Gott. Danke sehr, Mr. Knox. Alles, was du fühlst, verdankst du nur der Macht des Herrn.
It's neat how they keep using the mirror. You know, is he in the mirror? Which side is she on? I'll ruin the whole plot for you. It turns out that Sophie is just an imaginary daughter of the father who's writing about Sophie to his real daughter. You don't find that out to the end of the book. Sorry, ruined it for you. But she visits Socrates, she visits, I think, Galileo or Copernicus. You know, she visits all these individuals in kind of a Irish bishop.
1685 bis 1753. War hier.
So he's schizophrenic?
Pardon?
So he's schizophrenic?
Is he schizophrenic? He doesn't really exist either.
Just trying to put it the right way.
So the whole thing is actually a story written by her father because he's not home to, you know, kind of, and it's not Sophie.
Aber ist dann der Major so eine Art Gott für uns?
Ja, irgendwie schon.
Und was ist mit Hilde?
Hilde ist ein Engel, an den sich Gott wenden kann. Und Gott ist der Major.
I think it is Hilda. I think the real girl is Hilda.
Aber vielleicht ist es doch nicht ganz so. ist nicht Gott!
It's a famous book. Actually. I don't know where the lump on his head came from. I should have turned this off.